In January of 1953, Eunice Kennedy attended Sunday Mass with a man named Sargent Shriver. They had known each other for years. He was a lawyer, a Yale man, handsome and serious and genuinely good in the specific way that people who are genuinely good tend to be without performance, without calculation, without the particular Kennedy quality of goodness that was always slightly entangled with ambition. After Mass, they walked together to a side altar. They said a prayer, and then Eunice Kennedy turned to him and said, "Sargent Shriver, I think I'd like to marry you." She proposed to him, not the other way around. In 1953, a Kennedy woman, the daughter of Joseph Kennedy Sr., the man who had spent 30 years constructing a family institution whose operating logic required its women to be beautiful and presentable and silent, and above all, manageable, proposed marriage to a man she had decided she wanted, on her terms, at a side altar. After Mass, Sargent Shriver said yes. Now here is why that moment matters. Not because it is charming, though it is. Not because it is surprising, though it is that too. But because it is the clearest possible window into who Eunice Kennedy actually was before the world knew her name, before the Special Olympics, before the Presidential Medal of Freedom, before the 6 million athletes in 200 countries. Before any of it. She was a woman who decided what she wanted and went and got it. In a family that had a very specific, very enforced set of rules about what its women were permitted to want. Her father wanted sons. He had 4. Joe Jr., the one who was supposed to be president, who died in the war at 29. Jack, who became president and was murdered in Dallas. Bobby, who was murdered in Los Angeles. Ted, who drove a car off a bridge and spent the rest of his career carrying that night in the dark water with him. Joe Kennedy Sr. invested everything in those sons. His money, his strategy, his relentless, pressurized ambition. He built the Kennedy political dynasty specifically and deliberately around his boys. His daughters, Eunice, Patricia, Jean, Kathleen, were pieces of the larger picture. Beautiful pieces, important pieces for the family image, but pieces. Eunice Kennedy had absorbed that message her entire life. And then she had ignored it completely. She had gone to Stanford when the family expectation was that Kennedy women attended Catholic convent schools. She had worked in a women's prison in West Virginia as a social worker, not a charity gala, not a managed philanthropic appearance, but actual social work, in a prison with women that the world had decided to forget. She had worked with juvenile delinquents in Chicago. She had attended graduate school. She had built a career, a real operational results-producing career, in a decade when the women around her were being wives. And then she had walked up to a side altar after Sunday Mass and proposed to the man she wanted to marry. This is who Eunice Kennedy was, and the story of what she did with that specific, stubborn, completely unmanageable quality in a family that had spent generations trying to manage its women is one of the most important stories in American history that almost nobody has told properly. Because the version of Eunice Kennedy that the world received, the saint, the founder, the selfless champion of the disabled, is real. Every word of it is true, but it is not the whole picture. The whole picture includes the guilt, the 21 years of silence about what had been done to her sister, the specific, documented complicity of a woman who knew the truth about Rosemary's lobotomy and said nothing while she built her legacy. The complicated question of whether you can build something genuinely beautiful on a foundation that includes genuine failure, and the answer which this story will give you is more honest than the myth. I am Mary, and today we are going to talk about the Kennedy, the history books put in the footnote. The one who built more than any of them, and who carried more than any of them knew. Stay with me. Before the proposal, before Stanford, before the prison in West Virginia and the juvenile court in Chicago, there was a girl in Brookline, Massachusetts who was smaller and sicker than every sibling around her, who was called Puny Uni, and who decided before she was 10 years old that she was going to keep up with her brothers. No matter what it cost her. What that decision made her, and why it explains every single thing that followed. That is where we begin. Eunice Mary Kennedy was born on July 10th, 1921, in Brookline, Massachusetts, the fifth of 9 children, which meant she was born into a household that already had 4 children ahead of her: Joe Jr., Jack, Rosemary, Kathleen, and would have 4 more after her: Patricia, Bobby, Jean, Ted. She was the middle child in the specific mathematical sense of the word. Not the eldest, not the youngest, not the first daughter, not the last. The fifth. And she was small. Not delicate small in the way that the Kennedy mythology sometimes rendered its women. Small in the specific, medical sense, underweight at birth, susceptible to illness throughout her early childhood, the kind of child whose physical fragility stood in direct and uncomfortable contrast to the Kennedy family's foundational identity, which was built on vigor and competition, and the specific, pressurized athleticism of a patriarch who believed that strength was the only currency that mattered. The family called her Puny Uni. Not cruelly or not only cruelly, in the specific Kennedy way of naming things directly, and then expecting the named person to overcome whatever the name described. You are small. Now prove that it doesn't matter. Eunice proved it. With a ferocity that surprised even the people around her, she threw herself into the family's athletic culture with the specific determination of someone who had something to overcome. She swam. She sailed. She played football on the lawn at Hyannis Port, not as an observer, not as a cheerleader for her brothers, but as a participant who expected to be taken seriously. Her mother Rose later described her as mimicking her older brothers in everything, absorbing their leadership qualities, refusing to accept the specific, slightly lower ceiling that the Kennedy household's unspoken architecture assigned to its daughters. Rose Kennedy considered Eunice the most sensitive of her children, also the most devoutly religious, also the most mature. These 3 qualities, sensitivity, faith, maturity, existed in Eunice Kennedy in a specific combination that would shape everything she did for the rest of her life. The sensitivity meant she felt things deeply. The faith meant she had a framework for what to do with what she felt. The maturity meant she acted on it rather than performing it. She was not, in the Kennedy household, the obvious one. That was Jack. Jack Kennedy had the charm, the specific, luminous, entirely natural charm of a person who makes everyone in a room feel that they are the most interesting person present. He was the one people watched, the one the family's mythology eventually organized itself around. Eunice watched him her entire childhood. And she was not resentful, or not primarily resentful. She was competitive in the specific Kennedy way that competition operated in that household, where it was less about beating each other and more about meeting the standard the family had set. She wanted to be as good as her brothers. She worked toward that goal with the same relentless energy that Puny Uni had brought to the football games on the Hyannis Port lawn. But she was also watching something else. She was watching Rosemary. Rosemary Kennedy was born 3 years before Eunice in 1918, the third child, the first daughter. By the time Eunice was old enough to understand the world around her, it was already quietly apparent that Rosemary was different from her siblings. Slower to learn, slower to process, struggling with the academic work that the other Kennedy children absorbed with competitive ease. Rose Kennedy had hired private tutors. Joe Kennedy had arranged specialized schools. The family had constructed an elaborate architecture of concealment designed to keep Rosemary's limitations invisible to the world outside. But inside the family to her siblings, Rosemary was simply Rosemary. She was beautiful. She had dark hair and her father's easy smile, and a warmth that the people who knew her consistently described as the most immediately present quality about her. She loved to swim. She loved to dance. She loved dressing up and going to parties, and the specific, ordinary pleasures of a young woman who wanted what every young woman wants: to be included, to be loved, to be part of things. Eunice included her. This is documented specific, not myth. Eunice brought Rosemary into the athletic activities at Hyannis Port deliberately and consistently. When the Kennedy siblings swam races, Rosemary swam too. When they sailed, Rosemary sailed. When they competed, Eunice made sure Rosemary had a place in the competition, and Eunice later remembered, with a specificity that tells you how clearly she had watched her sister, that Rosemary swam like a deer, that she was genuinely good at it, that she loved winning. What Eunice understood about Rosemary, what she absorbed from years of watching her sister navigate a world that was not designed for her, was something that the rest of her family, including her parents, did not fully understand. Rosemary was not the problem. The world's response to Rosemary was the problem. This distinction, which sounds simple now, which is the foundational principle of every modern disability rights movement, was not simple in 1930 or 1935 or 1940. It was radical. It was the kind of understanding that came from watching someone clearly rather than managing them carefully. And Eunice Kennedy had been watching Rosemary clearly since she was old enough to watch anything. In 1941, Eunice was 20 years old. She was at Manhattanville College in New York, the same school that had produced several Kennedy women before her, the same school where Ethel Skakel would eventually become Jean Kennedy's roommate and begin the chain of events that led to her marriage to Bobby. In November of that year, while Eunice was at school, her father arranged the lobotomy. He did it without telling Rose. He did it without telling any of the children. He waited until the moment when the family was sufficiently dispersed that the decision could be made and implemented before anyone had the opportunity to object. And then it was done. Rosemary Kennedy entered that hospital in Washington and did not come back as herself. When Eunice learned what had happened, the exact timing of when each sibling was told is not fully documented. But the general account is that the children were told gradually, in managed versions of the truth that concealed the lobotomy itself for years. She did what every Kennedy sibling did. She absorbed it. She did not confront her father. She did not demand answers. She did not, in the specific language of the Kennedy institution, make it a problem. Because in the Kennedy household, the way you responded to the things that could not be changed was the same way you responded to being called puny Uni. You proved that it didn't stop you. You kept going. And for 21 years, from 1941 to 1962, Eunice Kennedy kept going. She graduated from Manhattanville. She transferred to Stanford, becoming the first Kennedy woman to complete a college degree, and graduated in 1943 with a degree in sociology. She worked for the State Department's Special War Problems Division. She became a social worker at the Federal Women's Penitentiary in Alderson, West Virginia, working with incarcerated women in conditions that made even her Kennedy-trained stoicism uncomfortable. She moved to Chicago. She worked with the House of Good Shepherd and the Chicago Juvenile Court with young women who had been failed by every system that was supposed to protect them. And in every room she entered the prison in West Virginia, the juvenile court in Chicago, the policy meetings in Washington, she saw the same thing she had seen watching Rosemary at Hyannisport. People that the world had decided to make invisible, and a system that was very good at making them stay that way. On May 23, 1953, Eunice Kennedy married Sargent Shriver at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. She was 31 years old. He was the right choice, not in the Kennedy institutional sense of the right family, the right connections, the right Catholic credentials, though he had all of those. In the deeper sense, he was the kind of man who was genuinely interested in the same things Eunice was interested in, who did not require her to be smaller than she was, who would go on to direct the Peace Corps and lead the war on poverty and run for Vice President of the United States, and who said, consistently, throughout their 56-year marriage, that Eunice was the driving intelligence behind everything that mattered in their shared life. She had 5 children with him: Robert, Maria, Timothy, Mark, Anthony, and she kept working because Sargent Shriver had said yes at the side altar after Mass, and that yes, unlike so many of the yeses inside the Kennedy family, turned out to mean exactly what it said. In 1957, Eunice Kennedy Shriver took over the direction of the Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. Foundation, and what she found when she began traveling the country, visiting the institutions where people like Rosemary were being kept, seeing the specific, documented conditions of those places, changed everything. What she saw in those buildings, what it did to her, and the decision she made in 1961, the moment her father had his stroke and could no longer stop her. That is coming. In 1957, Eunice Kennedy Shriver took over the direction of the Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. Foundation. The foundation had been established in 1946 inches, memory of Joe Jr., the eldest son, the one who had been groomed for the presidency, who had died when his explosive-laden plane detonated over the English Channel in August 1944. It had spent its first decade doing what Kennedy philanthropy had always done, supporting Catholic charities, funding hospitals, operating in the specific, managed way of a wealthy family foundation, whose primary function was the maintenance of the family's public image as much as any genuine charitable purpose. Eunice changed that. She redirected the foundation's focus entirely away from Catholic charities and toward research on intellectual disabilities. It was not a subtle shift. It was not a gradual reorientation. It was a decision made with the specific, total commitment of a woman who had spent 36 years watching what the world did to people like her sister and had decided that she was done watching. She had a specific reason for the urgency. In 1958, Eunice and Sargent traveled across the country together. They visited research institutions. They met with academics and physicians and policymakers who were working on intellectual disability. They went into the places where people like Rosemary were being kept. And what Eunice Kennedy Shriver found in those buildings changed her permanently. She described what she saw in various interviews over the years, and the description was consistent. Adults and children crowded into bleak rooms, people tied to chairs, reeking of urine, sitting in silence with nothing to do and no one paying attention to them. Facilities that bore no resemblance to the careful, loving care that Rosemary had received at her Catholic institution in Wisconsin, places where the primary goal was not care, but containment, where the operating assumption was that the people inside were beyond help, beyond development, beyond the possibility of a full human life. One specific thing Eunice said about what she saw has stayed with me since I first read it. She said she walked into those places and she thought about Rosemary swimming. She thought about her sister moving through the water at Hyannis Port with the specific, effortless grace that Eunice had described as swimming like a deer. She thought about the look on Rosemary's face when she won a race, the specific, unguarded joy of a person who has been told all her life that she cannot and has just proven otherwise. And then she looked at the rooms, at the people in the chairs, at the complete absence of anything that resembled what she had watched Rosemary experience at Hyannis Port. And she understood something that the medical and policy establishment of 1958 America had not yet understood. Not as an abstract principle, as a visceral, specific, personally witnessed truth. These people were not beyond help. They were beyond the help that anyone had bothered to offer them. The difference between those two things, which sounds simple, which is in fact the foundational shift in disability rights thinking that the rest of the 20th century would spend decades catching up to, was the difference between Rosemary swimming at Hyannis Port and Rosemary sitting in a chair in an institution that had decided she had nothing left to give the world. Eunice Kennedy Shriver had seen both, and she had decided which one was real. What happened next was not immediate. This is important because the myth of Eunice Kennedy Shriver tends to move quickly from the witnessing to the action, from the buildings she visited to the Special Olympics she founded, as if the path between them was straight and uncomplicated. It was not. Between 1958 and 1961, Eunice worked. She restructured the foundation. She funded research. She built relationships with the academics and policymakers who would eventually become the infrastructure of a national movement. She was doing the quiet, unglamorous, absolutely essential work of someone who understands that change at the institutional level requires institutional capacity before it requires anything else. But she was also waiting, not consciously, not in the specific, strategic sense of a person who has identified an obstacle and is biding their time. but in the deeper sense, the sense that anyone who grew up in the Kennedy household understood without being taught that certain things could not happen, while Joseph Kennedy Sr. was the controlling intelligence at the center of the family. Joe Kennedy had built his dynasty on concealment. The Rosemary secret was the most complete expression of that concealment instinct. He had arranged the lobotomy. He had placed Rosemary in Wisconsin. He had forbidden the other children from visiting her because he believed that exposure to her condition would destabilize them, would remind them of something the family needed to forget in order to keep moving forward. He had constructed an elaborate fiction that Rosemary was teaching at a school in the Midwest, that she was simply reclusive, that her absence from family life was a matter of preference rather than confinement. And while Joe was alive and speaking, while he retained the full force of his authority over the family he had built that fiction held, Eunice knew the truth. She had always known the truth, or enough of it, and she said nothing. For 21 years, Eunice Kennedy Shriver, the woman who had proposed to her husband at a side altar after Mass, who had worked in a women's prison and a juvenile court, and had spent years staring into the specific cruelty of what America did to its most vulnerable people, said nothing publicly about what had been done to her sister. The historian, Eileen McNamara, who wrote the definitive biography of Eunice Kennedy Shriver, said something about this period that I want you to hold. She said she believed there was genuine guilt in Eunice, that Eunice felt complicit in some specific, painful way in having let Rosemary languish far from home, in having been part of the silence, in having built her early career advocacy work around disability rights, while the person whose life had first shown her why that work mattered was sitting in a house in Wisconsin that the family was pretending did not exist. That guilt was real, and it was about to become fuel. On December 19th, 1961, Joseph Kennedy Sr. suffered a massive stroke. He was 73 years old. He had been at the Palm Beach estate when it happened. He survived, but the stroke took his voice. His right side was paralyzed. He could no longer speak. He could no longer walk properly. He could no longer issue the directives and enforce the silences that had been the operating system of the Kennedy family for 40 years. Joe Kennedy lost his voice on December 19th, 1961, and Eunice Kennedy found hers. Within weeks, she was making calls. Within months, she was in Wisconsin. She brought Rosemary back, not permanently, not immediately, not in the full, restored way that decades of absence cannot simply reverse. But she went. She sat with her sister. She began the long, complicated process of reintegrating Rosemary into the family that had been pretending she did not exist. And Rosemary recognized her. Unlike the accounts of Rose Kennedy's visits where Rosemary had screamed, where the recognition had come with pain and anger and the specific distress of a woman who remembered being left with Eunice, it was different. It was not easy. Nothing about those early visits was easy. Rosemary was not the sister Eunice had watched swimming at Hyannis Port. The lobotomy had taken too much. The decades had taken too much. What remained was partial fragments of the woman she had been, preserved in the specific, unreachable way that damage to the brain sometimes preserves things it cannot restore. But Rosemary knew her, and Eunice came back, again and again and again. She brought Rosemary to her home in Bethesda, Maryland. She included her in family meals. She took her on walks and swims, because even now, even after everything, Rosemary still loved the water. And while she was doing that, while she was privately rebuilding what the family had broken, she was also preparing to do something publicly that the Kennedy Institution had never permitted anyone to do. Tell the truth, or part of it. In September 1962, Eunice Kennedy Shriver published an article in the Saturday Evening Post. It was titled, "Hope for Retarded Children." By the standards of 1962 America, where intellectual disability was a source of shame so profound that most families hid their affected members from public view, where the language used to describe people like Rosemary was clinical and dehumanizing and designed to manage rather than include the article, was an act of genuine courage. Eunice wrote about Rosemary directly. She named her. She described her disabilities honestly. She made the argument radical at the time that intellectual disability could happen in any family, rich or poor, powerful or ordinary, that it was not shameful, that the people it affected were not less than human, that they deserved inclusion and opportunity and the specific, non-negotiable dignity of being seen, she wrote. And this line appeared in print in 1962, a full decade before the disability rights movement had the institutional language to say it this clearly. It fills me with sadness to think this change might not have been necessary if we knew then what we know today. She was talking about Rosemary. She was not mentioning the lobotomy. The article did not contain the word lobotomy. It did not describe the hospital in Washington in November 1941. It did not name Walter Freeman or James Watts. It did not describe the instrument inserted through the eye socket. It did not explain that Rosemary had not simply deteriorated, that she had been surgically altered by her father's decision without her knowledge or consent in a procedure that the American Medical Association had not approved. Eunice Kennedy Shriver knew all of that. She had known it for years. She left it out. And here is the question that the myth of Eunice Kennedy Shriver never fully answers, the question that the Saturday Evening Post article forces you to ask, and that the Special Olympics legacy makes it very easy to avoid. Was that a mission protection? Was it guilt? Was it the specific, deep-seated Kennedy instinct for concealment that had been trained into her since childhood? The same instinct that had kept her silent for 21 years while Rosemary sat in Wisconsin? Or was it calculation, the understanding that the truth of the lobotomy, told in 1962, would have destroyed the article's message, would have turned a watershed moment in disability rights into a Kennedy family scandal, would have made the story about Joe Kennedy's crime rather than about the 6 million people who needed what Eunice was trying to build? The honest answer is that it was probably all of those things simultaneously. And the most honest thing about Eunice Kennedy Shriver, the thing that the saint version of her story cannot accommodate, is that she built something genuinely world-changing on a foundation that included genuine moral compromise. She told part of the truth, not all of it. And what she built with the part she told changed the world in ways that the full truth, told differently, might not have. Whether that makes her a hero or something more complicated than a hero is a question this story is not going to answer for you, because it is the question you need to answer for yourself. The article was published in September 1962. The response was immediate and larger than anything Eunice had anticipated. Letters poured in from families across America who had been hiding their own Rosemarys, who had been told to be ashamed, who had been managing the silence alone. And one letter in particular from a mother in Washington whose son had been turned away from a summer camp because of his disability set in motion, the specific chain of events that would produce the most recognizable thing Eunice Kennedy Shriver ever built. What that mother asked, what Eunice said, and what happened in a backyard in Maryland in the summer of 1962 that would eventually become the Special Olympics. That is next. The letter came from a mother in Washington. Her son had intellectual disabilities. She had been trying to find him a place to go that summer, a camp, an organized activity, somewhere he could be with other children and do the things that other children did. She had contacted program after program, camp after camp. And the answer, delivered with varying degrees of gentleness and directness, was always the same. We don't accept children like that. She had heard about Eunice Kennedy Shriver's advocacy work. She had read the Saturday Evening Post article, and so she wrote a letter asking what she should do. Eunice's response was immediate. She said, and this is documented, this is her own account of what happened, she said. You don't have to talk about it anymore. You come here a month from today. Not a referral, not a policy recommendation, not a carefully managed philanthropic gesture designed to produce good press for the Kennedy family. Come here, a month from today. In the summer of 1962, Eunice Kennedy Shriver opened the gates of Timberlawn, the family's estate in Bethesda, Maryland, and invited children with intellectual disabilities to come and use it. She called it Camp Shriver. She recruited local high school students to serve as counselors. She organized swimming and sailing and football and every sport that she had played at Hyannis Port as a child. Every sport that Rosemary had loved and been good at, and had been denied in institution after institution that had decided she was beyond the reach of ordinary joy. She charged nothing. She simply opened the gate. And what happened inside that gate, what those children did when given a space and a structure and the specific, radical assumption that they were capable, is something that Eunice Kennedy Shriver described for the rest of her life with a consistency that tells you it was the most clarifying thing she had ever witnessed. They competed. They ran, and they swam, and they sailed, and they fell, and they got up, and they tried again. They lost races, and were disappointed, and came back for the next one. They won, and were proud in the specific, unguarded, completely authentic way of people who have been told all their lives that winning is not something available to them. Eunice's son, Tim, who was 5 or 6 years old that summer, young enough that the memory is sensory rather than analytical, described looking out his bedroom window in the morning and seeing the children arriving, seeing his mother moving among them, seeing, in the specific way that children absorb things before they have language for them, that something important was happening in their backyard. Something that was not about the Kennedy name. Something that was not about politics or dynasty or the carefully managed image of a family that had decided its function was greatness. Something that was just people, being seen. Camp Shriver ran for 4 years. From 1962 to 1965, Eunice opened those gates every summer. The camp grew. Word spread through the networks of families who had been told for years that there was nowhere for their children to go. Through the disability advocacy community that Eunice had been building relationships with since her foundation work began, through the specific, powerful word of mouth of parents who had watched their children do things that the medical establishment had told them were impossible. Eunice watched the camp grow and she understood something. One backyard was not enough. One family's estate in Maryland, however generously opened, however completely committed, could not reach the 1.5 million children with intellectual disabilities across the United States who had no athletic programs, no competitive opportunities, no organized spaces where the foundational assumption was that they were capable rather than contained. She needed something bigger. She needed something that the Kennedy name, which she had spent her entire life being slightly overshadowed by, could actually help build. Here is where the story of Eunice Kennedy Shriver intersects with the story of the brother she had spent her whole life watching. Jack Kennedy was inaugurated as the 35th President of the United States on January 20th, 1961. Eunice was there. And before the inauguration, before the oath of office, before the speech that the country would quote for decades, Eunice had gotten a commitment from her brother. She had pushed him. Ted Kennedy described this in later years with the specific, rueful affection of a younger sibling who had watched an older sibling operate at close range for decades. He said that every member of the Kennedy family was slightly afraid of seeing Eunice coming toward them, because Eunice always had an agenda, and the agenda was always specific, and she did not leave the room until she had what she came for. What she came for from Jack before he took the oath of office was a commitment to establish a presidential panel on intellectual disabilities, a formal, government-funded, policy-producing body that would do for intellectual disability what the polio campaign had done for polio: bring it out of the shadows, fund the research, change the institutional response. Jack said yes. The President's Panel on Mental Retardation was established in 1961. Eunice staffed it herself, filling it with every expert she had spent 4 years cultivating during her foundation work. She ran it the way she ran everything, with total commitment, zero sentimentality, and the specific driving impatience of a woman who had been watching the wrong thing happen for too long. The last piece of legislation that John F. Kennedy signed before he was murdered in Dallas in November 1963 was the Community Mental Health Act legislation that began the process of deinstitutionalization that started moving people like Rosemary out of the bleak facilities Eunice had visited in 1958 and into community-based care. Jack signed it on October 31st, 1963. He was murdered 22 days later. And Eunice, who had been pushing her brother for 3 years, who had staffed his panel and filled his schedule with meetings, and extracted commitments from him that his advisors sometimes found inconvenient, Eunice attended his funeral and then went back to work. Because that was what Eunice Kennedy did. The Special Olympics were born on July 20th, 1968, in Soldier Field in Chicago, Illinois. 1,000 athletes with intellectual disabilities from 26 states and Canada competed in track and field events and swimming and floor hockey. The Chicago Park District had co-organized. The Kennedy Foundation had provided the funding, and Eunice Kennedy Shriver stood at the podium in front of those 1,000 athletes and said something that became, in the years that followed, one of the defining statements of the disability rights movement. She said, "In ancient Rome, the gladiators went into the arena with these words on their lips: Ave Caesar, morituri te salutant. We who are about to die salute you. And today I bring you the message of the Special Olympics, let me win. But if I cannot win, let me be brave in the attempt." The crowd responded with the specific, enormous energy of people who have been told all their lives that they are not allowed to be in this kind of room. Eunice watched them, and she thought about Rosemary. She had always thought about Rosemary, the sister who had loved winning, who had swum like a deer, who had practiced her curtsy for hours before Buckingham Palace, who had written, "Darling Daddy, I am so fond of you" 1 year before her father had a surgical instrument inserted into her brain. Rosemary was not at Soldier Field in 1968. She was in Wisconsin. She would never fully understand what her sister had built in her name. But Eunice had built it, out of guilt and love, and the specific, stubborn refusal of a woman who had been called puny Uni, and had decided that what you were called was not the same as what you were. The Special Olympics grew, every 2 years alternating winter and summer games in cities across the world. By the time Eunice Kennedy Shriver died in August 2009, the organization served 5 million athletes in 170 countries. It had become, in the specific, unmistakable way of things that are built on a genuine truth rather than a manufactured one of the most beloved institutions in the world. Athletes who had been told they could not compete competing. Families who had been told to be ashamed watching their children win medals. Communities that had been built around exclusion, reorganized around inclusion. All of it from a backyard in Bethesda. From a gate that Eunice opened in the summer of 1962 and never closed. But here is what the Special Olympics story, the clean, celebrated, Presidential Medal of Freedom version of the story, tends to leave out. Eunice Kennedy Shriver built all of this while carrying something she had been carrying since 1941. Something she had chosen to leave out of the Saturday Evening Post article. Something that her own daughter, Maria, said was present in her, an obsession in the family. Maria called it about not talking about things, the lobotomy, the specific truth of what had been done to Rosemary, the documented fact that the woman whose story had powered the entire engine of Eunice's life's work had not simply deteriorated, had been surgically altered by her father without consent, in a procedure that had destroyed rather than helped her, in a decision that the family had hidden for decades. Eunice knew. She had always known. And she had spent 47 years from 1941 to 1988, when the historian Doris Kearns Goodwin finally published the lobotomy story in her book, carrying that knowledge while building the thing that she hoped, perhaps, would make the carrying worth something. Whether it did, whether anything can make that worth something, is the question that Part 5 will ask. In 1984, Ronald Reagan awarded Eunice Kennedy Shriver the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the United States. She was the first woman to receive it for disability rights work. She stood in the White House and accepted it. And in that same year, 4 years before the lobotomy story became public, Eunice Kennedy Shriver was still carrying what she knew, what the final years of her life looked like. What she said about Rosemary when she finally could say everything. And the specific, documented moment, decades after that backyard in Bethesda, when Rosemary Kennedy came home, what that homecoming looked like, and what it cost, is coming. In 1988, the historian Doris Kearns Goodwin published the lobotomy story. For the first time in a mainstream, widely read, seriously researched book, the full truth of what had happened to Rosemary Kennedy in that Washington hospital in 1941 was public. Eunice Kennedy Shriver was 67 years old. She had been carrying that truth for 47 years. She did not give a major public statement about it. She did not hold a press conference. She went to Wisconsin. She sat with Rosemary, and she kept working. In her final years, Eunice brought Rosemary home as often as she could, to Bethesda, to Hyannis Port, to the house where the same family that had hidden her for 20 years now made room for her at the table. Rosemary came to the White House. Eunice had made that happen specifically, deliberately, because she understood that visibility was not just symbolic. That when people with intellectual disabilities walked into rooms where power lived, it changed what power believed was possible. Rosemary walked into the White House. Because Eunice opened that door. In 2005, Rosemary Kennedy died at St. Coletta in Jefferson, Wisconsin. She was 86 years old. She had lived 64 years in that institution. She had outlived her father and her mother and two of her brothers. Eunice attended her funeral. 4 years later, on August 11th, 2009, Eunice Kennedy Shriver died at Cape Cod Hospital in Hyannis, Massachusetts. She was 88 years old. 2 weeks before her brother Ted died of brain cancer, she had spent 52 years building something for the sister she could not save. Here is what I want to leave you with. Not the medal, not the ceremony, not the 6 million athletes or the 200 countries or the legislation that changed how America treated its most vulnerable people. This. Eunice Kennedy Shriver was complicit in her sister's disappearance for 21 years, and then she spent 52 years making it right. Those two things are both true. They do not cancel each other out. They exist simultaneously, the silence and the work, the guilt and the redemption, the woman who said nothing and the woman who changed everything. And the question I want to leave you with is not about Eunice specifically. It is about what we do with our failures. Whether guilt can be fuel, whether something built on silence can still be true. Whether 52 years of work is enough to answer 21 years of quiet. Eunice Kennedy Shriver seemed to believe it could be. 6 million people are glad she tried. I Am Mary. The full Kennedy series is here. Rose built the institution. Ethel refused to disappear inside it. Joan was made invisible by it. And Eunice spent her life trying to make it mean something different. All 4 stories together are the full picture. I will see you there.